Hey, Tim Frisch with A Frisch Perspective, bringing you analysis, reviews, and fun from a Christian nerd's point of view. Today I'm going to talk about the subject of masculinity and manhood and how that relates to our culture right now. I remember years ago when I was younger, there was a commercial on television for the Marines talking about how they're looking for a few good men. I don't know how many of you remember that or saw that. But if you're old enough, you probably do remember that. And there was even a movie back in the 90s called A Few Good Men. And it got me thinking, actually. It relates to this subject of manhood and how today, I'm not sure you would see a slogan like that, because the Marines looking for men, it sounds to people today like you're focusing only on men, and you think only men can be in the armed forces and do something useful for military purposes. That's not the intent, but I think the idea back then was that when they're looking for people to fight, when they're looking for people to go into combat, they are looking for some men. And it's interesting that that was considered kind of a good way of thinking, or a normal way of thinking. And now I think today we might have some reservations about that. We might be taken aback a little bit by that. Do we look at it the same way, that men are the one we should look to go into combat? And I think it's just indicative of a shift that we've seen in how we look at men and manhood. But really the theme of this video that I want to bring out today is that we need manhood today. We need men more than ever today. And I think a lot of people already agree with this. It's nothing profound. But I do want to give some commentary on just to get us to think about how we look at men in our culture. And I kind of started to get into this a little bit yesterday in talking about the Black Lives Matter organization and how they really are just focused on empathy. And when I personally think of empathy, I think of how mothers and women and that feminine side of humanity tends to be caring for and protective of others. And so empathy is something that's important, but also you need other things other than empathy. And when I think about masculinity, that's kind of the other side of the coin. Now, this gets into some interesting things about how we define masculinity and femininity, and so I'm generalizing, and I don't want people to take this the wrong way. But what I want to say kind of in general is that with that example I used of a few good men, I think it shows there's been a shift in our culture's thinking about the way that we perceive men and manhood versus woman and womanhood. Clearly there has been a shift in our culture over the last few decades, and really it's been a long process even before the last few decades. But if I had to just make a generalization, I kind of sense that our culture's mood tends to be averse to manhood in certain ways. Now, I don't think that that's true in every sense. It's not true across the board, but there are reasons, there are things that have fed into kind of a mood in our culture that is wary of manhood or averse to men and masculinity. You've definitely heard the term toxic masculinity. So it's interesting that when we talk about masculinity, that often a word that can be associated with that today is toxic. Whereas you're not as likely to hear the word toxic next to femininity, although people have talked about that, but it's not as common. So I think that there are reasons why manhood is looked down on today. And I'm generalizing. It doesn't mean that everybody's against men, but there's just definitely a mood of negativity, maybe suspicion, and sometimes outright anger toward the idea of masculinity and manhood. It's interesting. I just got a comment from my last video because I was talking a little bit about masculinity and I mentioned the word patriarchy, and the comment says, "You confuse patriarchy with masculinity. Natural masculinity is caring and protective. It's not so much about power and control for its own sake. Patriarchy is all about power and dominance." I think that comment really speaks to the fact that it's really how you define these words and how you think about these words that is going to play into this whole discussion. But for me, when I think about patriarchy, I have some agreement with what's being said there. I can totally understand that to people today, patriarchy to them sounds like power and dominance. But it's interesting, this person separating that from masculinity. But I was thinking about how when young boys play, how do they tend to play? They're more likely to have scuffles and fights. And I used to do that as a young boy. And I think you still see that today with a lot of boys. It's just kind of natural. Whereas how do girls tend to play? They're more communal. They're more cooperative in their play. That doesn't mean they don't fight, but I'm just kind of generalizing that when you think of women and femininity, it is much more communal, and men and masculinity are much more about competition. So I don't think you, at least in my thinking, can totally separate the idea of dominance from masculinity. It seems to be kind of baked into the cake with guys that they want to fight and they want to have a one-up, and there is a power struggle, physically even, with guys a lot of times. So you see that even with children. Now, am I saying that patriarchy, when it comes to how men have dominated and how they've treated people, is a good thing? Well, that's the problem, is that, in the past, we have definitely in our culture and throughout history condoned practices that are wrong. But why are they wrong? What makes them wrong? Are they wrong because our culture says they're wrong? In my view, I think that they're wrong because God actually says that those things are wrong. Does the Bible ever tell men to mistreat women? No. It does tell men that they're to lead women. I do think you see that principle in the Bible, but you're to lead in a very loving and servant-hearted way. So that idea of being controlling and dominant and uncaring, that definitely is a distortion of what God wants us to be as far as that idea of men being leaders. So it's interesting when it's how you define these terms, and looking at that word patriarchy too. This person, and again, I really appreciate comments, but they define patriarchy in kind of a negative way, and I understand why, because of the abuse of power that we've seen among men in the way they mistreat people. That's not right. But when you look at the Bible, just to look at the biblical view, who do we look at as the people of faith of the initial part of the Bible? We call them the patriarchs. So it's actually something that Christians have openly acknowledged and affirmed, that there is the idea of patriarchs. Now, we don't mean it, again, in the way that people mean it today, but certainly men were looked at as having a very key role, and especially a leadership role. And in our society, that was the case for a long time. Now, there are two sides to it, and this kind of speaks to what I'm saying. Men were always looked at as being leaders in our culture historically, but they were also looked at as being the ones who need to go out and risk their lives. They need to be the first ones out there to protect. And again, that gets back to what I said about looking for a few good men that the Marines had as their slogan. So with this entire mood shift and change in thinking, in my opinion, I really believe, and I know a lot of people would agree with it, that we need men, we need good masculinity more than ever right now, when it's actually tempting to cave into this anti-masculine sentiment. Now, some people may not agree that it's there, but I really do believe that there's been this anti-masculine sentiment in our culture. And the problem, I just want to identify and acknowledge the problem, has been a lack of healthy manhood in the first place. And I acknowledge that, some of the fault, and maybe a lot of the fault, is men themselves for why we're not treated with as much respect as we should be. Because have we demonstrated healthy manhood? Men who act with responsibility and integrity. That's missing a lot. And so there are a lot of people in our culture that haven't had good male role models. They haven't had that modeled for them, what good, healthy masculinity looks like. And there are also challenges to being the right kind of man. There are many temptations for men. And so as men, we've failed many times. Men can fail to demonstrate the leadership responsibility that they should show. They can also fail to be faithful and act with integrity to their wives and their family. So, as men, we've failed many times. But I will say this, it's not easy to be a man. It's not easy to be anybody. But just because it's hard to be a man right now doesn't mean it's time for us to just relinquish everything about our manhood. I actually think instead of giving up, it is a time to step up as men. I really believe that. And I love how there's a phrase in the Bible in, I believe, 1 Corinthians 16:13, where Paul is talking to the church and he's telling them to be courageous, but he uses a phrase, to be like men. The King James Version translated it, quit yourselves like men. And newer versions might say act like men. But the idea there is to be a man. We might say to man up, be courageous, right? So Paul is kind of saying that, right? We're looking for a few good men. But what he's really saying is be courageous. And it just reflects that idea of men need to stand up. Now, he's not specifically only talking to men, but his phrase shows what I'm talking about. That idea of masculinity as standing up and having courage. And even women can demonstrate that at times. But why does he use the term man? Because men embody that idea of courage and standing up. And so we need to do that right now as men. I really think we're going to lose big in our culture if we continue to allow culture to distort and replace biblical and healthy masculinity with a move toward a different extreme. And again, I'm acknowledging that there have been problems with how men have operated in our culture in the past, but we can move to the other extreme and go from one unhealthy extreme to another unhealthy extreme. And I love what Ali Stuckey said in a tweet a couple years ago. She wrote, "If masculinity were truly toxic, then kids growing up without dads would be presumably better off than those who have them. But they're not. They tend to be more depressed, aggressive, and criminal. Truth is, we need more masculinity in society, not less." And that's really the message that I'm getting at here in this video, is that it's tempting right now in our culture. There's kind of this anti-masculine sentiment, but I really agree with what she's saying there in essence. We actually need more masculinity right now. It needs to be healthy masculinity. It needs to be, from a Christian perspective, godly masculinity, but we need men right now. Now, as men, we've got to do this the right way. And that's why I say healthy masculinity. It needs to be compassionate. It needs to be engaged, right? We need to be paying attention and caring for people around us. But we've got to act like men in a culture that in many ways is rejecting masculinity and manhood or distorting it. Another example of the sentiment of our culture right now is television shows, movies, but I'm watching one right now with my wife and my daughter. Ironically, I'm watching it with a couple of women. And in the show, it's a pretty neat show, but the protagonist, the main character, is a woman, and she investigates crime and fights crime. But I noticed that, there's this woman and she's fighting men, and she's actually physically fighting men all the time and overpowering men. And, when I watch that, it just to me speaks to our culture's desire to kind of disrupt and overturn that idea of men being the one who have power. And here this woman protagonist is actually able to physically overpower men. And it kind of just shows you what I'm talking about. It's an illustration of how our culture wants to envision men and women in the way they relate to each other, that women have the physical power to dominate men. And that's what you see in a show like that. But my reaction to that is, I don't know. There's a lot I could say about that. It just doesn't seem like it's an accurate portrayal of real life in many ways. And of course, TV shows usually aren't. But it's a bit idealistic, and it just shows me something about our culture more than about reality. But I'll leave that alone. You get the point I'm making. But, if we're going to be men at this time, we're going to act like men, I do believe there will be backlash. I think when you stand for something that is right in a culture that doesn't like something, you're going to get reaction. But let me say this. When something is not popular is a lot of times when you need it more than ever. When something's not popular, that's the time when you need it more than ever. And so that's what I'm saying in all this. I really think that even though masculinity is not a popular thing right now, that's why we need it more than ever. And I actually think there's a lot of evidence in our society and our culture that it's desperate for this. It makes me think about how humans will often cry out against something when they desperately want it. And I think of that with children, how children will, when they're actually wanting a parent to kind of step down and give them boundaries and show that there's safety there and they actually need discipline, that's sometimes when children are acting like they don't want discipline at all, right? They're just going nuts and crazy. But really that's a desperate cry for someone to step in and show that they're safe and that there are boundaries. And I think really there's evidence in our culture right now that people desperately want fathers. They desperately want men who can be men, caring men, right? Men who actually are loving and servants, but they want men and masculinity. And isn't it interesting that in all that's happened with the political environment, who do we have as our two candidates right now? For both Republicans and Democrats, we ended up with two men. And I mean, that's nothing unusual, but it's actually two men that you could describe as like fighting kind of men. And I just think that's ironic. But maybe it does speak to the deep down desire for people in our culture right now to want men to step up and fight and be men. And so, all in all, going back to that phrase, a few good men, we definitely need men right now at this time in our culture. But we don't just need a few good men. We need many good men. So men, I'm just calling on myself and all of us to step up and show what good, healthy, godly masculinity looks like right now in a time where our culture desperately needs it and I think secretly longs for it. Those are my thoughts. I'd love to hear what you think about this in the comments below. I hope you understand that when I give my perspective, I'm just giving a viewpoint. I'm not saying everybody has to look at it my way, but those are some of my thoughts, and thank you as always for listening to what I have to say from A Frisch Perspective.